Yeah. Okay, guys, we're gonna get started with Breakout here. So we're continuing thinking about CSS, and the name for this lecture is CSS is not easy. You probably didn't get too deep into CSS just on day one of Twitter, but maybe getting your fingers a bit into it. But from today's stuff or previous working with CSS, what has made CSS hard for you in the past, or what makes CSS hard in general? Yeah, getting things where you want them. What other stuff is hard or confusing in CSS? Specificity, yeah, that's something we're going to be talking about today. Knowing how to apply selectors so that the style you're typing actually gets applied to your things. I'm sure we've been in the cases where we're like, okay, I want a nice margin of 20 pixels. I find my div or element and I add a new style thing and it just doesn't do anything. So that's frustrating. We're going to be looking at position just as a property of CSS to kind of see. We're going to be looking at IDs and classes, selectors, specificity. So hopefully we can clear that up a little bit. And lastly, we're just going to kind of look at the idea of frameworks in CSS. Before we jump into it, let's look at this mnemonic trouble or TRBL. You've seen that when we're using things like margin or padding, I can go margin dash left, and I can set a specific value. I can do margin dash right, margin dash top, margin dash bottom. But a quicker way to do it is just to use the margin property without any specific thing and set all four at once. There's a few different styles that we can do this, where we can set all four in the same go. Margin, padding, usually things with position with border, we can do that. But then it becomes confusing as to which of these numbers correspond to which margin. And then this trouble, TRBL, is the mnemonic that we can use to remember. So it's always top, right, bottom, and then left. So my margin here, the top one's 15, my right margin's 10, my bottom's 15 again, and then my left one is 10 again. Same with padding, same with anyone that's going to be looking like that. Although, sometimes you're only adding a left margin, go ahead and use the margin dash left if it's going to be 0, 0, or defaults 0, 0, 0, and then one number. Margin dash left is just as fine. Yeah, exactly. It goes clockwise from the 12 position. Around is another way to think of it. Whatever helps you remember kind of the order so you don't have to look it up. So position, let's get this looking a little nicer. So we have position as a style property within CSS. And there's a couple different ways that we can set it to. I've listed them here. We can see there's static, relative, absolute, fixed, and then something called sticky, which we'll look at a little bit. The default for all of our elements that we'll be using, if we don't touch them, is static. That means you cannot set top, right, bottom, or left. The element's just going to appear next in line or next new line, depending on if it's new line or block. just as it normally would. So I've got this little HTML page. I'm linking a style sheet position.css. In my body, I have one div called container, and inside that container, I have another div called box, just with the number 1. And then the style, like small style that I've set up, this is just to get the font looking nice. But my container, so that outer div, has a border of 5 pixels, and it's going to be color slate gray. And then my box, I'm using a background image, box.png. This is telling the background image to be contained within the sizes of my box, because I've given it a width, height, and a margin. And let's look at this is what it looks like so far. So here's my container, which is just that. If we look in our browser tools again, my container is just this guy with the border, and then my box is just this guy here. The contain just keeps that background image within the bounds of 200 by 200. If I remove that, if I comment this guy out, save, and refresh, that's all I'm doing there. Okay, so by default, my box here is static positioning. It's inside this container, so when it is placed, its default is just to go to the top left thing because it's a block element. If I add a bunch of other, duplicates of this box, I'm just going to copy this line, maybe give ourselves a couple more boxes to play with. I'm just going to give them different numbers so we can distinguish them. 2, 3, 4, and a 5th box. I have all these different boxes, and they're all just statically positioned. So this is where they should be. It's just the most common sense spot on the page. What I can do is if I grab, say, box 3, I can give it a different position property. So right in my CSS, I can say, let's make a new selector for a class called, we'll do relative, because we're going to be setting the position of this relative class to relative. And then in our HTML, I'm just going to grab box number 3. I'm going to give it the relative class. So when we're assigning classes to elements, if I go box space relative, it just means I've applied 2 separate classes here. I've applied one class called box, one class called relative. If I had another space thing, now it has 3 different classes. It's not one class called box space relative space thing. It's just that those 2 guys in there. Okay. So if I'm giving this 3rd box a relative position, I save and I refresh, nothing happens. What relative does do is it now allows me to be able to set those like trouble properties. So I can say position relative, and I want to say the top should be 100 pixels, whatever that means. I want to say left should be 100 pixels. So now if I look at my boxes, I can see that the 3rd box, which is relative, this guy, is kind of offset. And that's what relative positioning is used for. It's used to offset my different elements in my layout. So we can see I've got the position relative on this one, and top 100, left 100 means that I want to go down 100 pixels and right 100 pixels from the spot where it would normally be if it was static. So 3 box would have been positioned, right here somewhere. And with my relative thing, I'm just saying, move it 100 pixels down and 100 pixels right from where it should have been. But the one thing we can see is that the space that is taking up now is not really, like 4 is not acting as if the 3 box is where it is. 4 is still kind of acting as if the 3 box had been positioned statically where it should have been. So if I had 1, 2, 3 box here, 4 box here, that would make sense. I can illustrate this even further. If we, right here in our developer tools, I'll make this bigger for you guys again. If we go to that relative, where was it? If we look for the relative class, here, if I say top, let's go 200. Now it's like overlapping with box 4. So it's definitely not pushing box 4 out of the space, the new space that's taking up. Relative's behavior is that the element is going to push other things that it's interacting with out of the space that it should be taking up, but not out of the place that you've moved it to. So I've moved 3 down and to the right, but according to boxes 1 through 5, they all think it's still in its static position. So relative positioning is nice to kind of like nudge things around a little bit according to where they need to be. Like if I want to take 1 and just like shift it a couple pixels up or down, that can be done with like relative positioning. But let's look at some of the other positionings that we can use. So the other one we saw was absolute. So similarly, if I go position absolute, and then in my HTML, we give box 2 maybe some absolute positioning. I hit refresh. I'm going to remove the relative one from box 3 so we can just see what absolute is doing a little more clearly. So right away we see that 2 and 3 are now like stacked on top of each other. If we look the inspector, I can see this is box absolute 1, and I can't really grab the one underneath. Maybe I'll look through the HTML thing here. So there's my box 2, and there's my box 3. So the first thing we notice is that absolute, unlike relative or static, doesn't respect, or the other elements around it don't respect its kind of space. Box 1, 3, 4, and 5 are behaving as if box 2 right now just didn't exist. And that's how it's going to work with absolute positioning. They're just going to like ignore the existence of the absolute guy. Second thing we can see is that the position, or the default position of the box when I set absolute is kind of where it would have been if it was static. So this is where box 2 would have been, but it's, again, kind of being ignored by the other things. But the advantage of absolute positioning comes in when we start setting those like top and left things. So if I go top 0, and I go right 0, from a relative perspective, I should see no change. But from an absolute perspective, if I hit refresh, my box comes all the way up here. So relative positioning are positioned relative to where they would have been static. Absolute positionings are positioned relative to either the first parent they can find that has a position or the body of the entire document. So what I mean by that is my container, we can show kind of an example. So my container, I'm just going to give it a margin of, or a margin top maybe, of 100 pixels. And when I refresh here, my box 2, which is absolute, is like outside of the container. So it's positioned absolutely to the body. So it's in 0, 0 of the body of my whole thing. because the container has no explicit position to it. So by default, kind of, it's going to be absolute to the whole window of your HTML document, or the whole body of your HTML document. The top left corner down to the bottom is kind of default. But if I then give my container a position, and I could give it a relative position, and we refresh this, we now see that my box drops down to be 0, 0 within my container. So any absolute element is just looking upwards. It's saying, hey, parent, do you have like a position attribute set? And if it doesn't, it looks into the higher one. And if it doesn't find any, it's eventually going to find one in the body, because the body has, you know, the position set. But I can also say that I want it absolutely positioned by giving its parent a relative position. Again, if I remove that, it goes right to the top. I can set also like bottom, oh, not here, with absolute, I could say bottom 0. And it's going to be, so my body is ending there. Let's see. It's higher than I thought it would be. Let's try and figure out why. Height, margin, width. It looks like initially our body is like the size of this window, so we can do an experiment. Let's shrink our window a bit so that it's, yeah. So it's our body is being resized as our window is resized. So it's 0 is hitting the bottom of our window frame. Whereas if we set it to, if we give then that position relative to our container doesn't change shape based on the window. So it'll always be at the bottom here. So absolute ones, they're kind of the hardest to figure out, and they're the least like responsive in a lot of senses, because especially if I'm positioning this relative to the whole page, I really have to know like exactly, you know, how many pixels over and down everything's going to be. Whereas when I have a relative thing to base it off of, I can kind of let my layout be based on other parts of my layout. Let's look at the next one. So we had absolute. We also had fixed. So I'm making a new selector for a class fixed. I'm giving the position fixed. And we can leave it at that. We will give this first guy, this first box, a fixed class, so it gets the styles. And the other thing that will help us to see this, if I take my container, I'm just going to give the container a height of 1,000 pixels. So it's a bit bigger in the Y direction. And now I'm going to refresh this. So again, the other elements are not respecting my element 1's space. They are just overlapping it as it would. Element 1, which is right here, is positioned where it would be if it was static. But then if I scroll, it moves with me. So absolute is positioned, well, let's go. So static is just where it is. Relative is positioned relative to where it would be statically. Absolute is positioned relative to the parent, either the body or the nearest positioned container. And then fixed is positioned relative to the browser view. So it's not relative to the, for example, my body starts here. This guy starts in this corner here. And as I scroll, it moves up. So that's the content of the page. The view of the page is, this point in the view here is always there. Like it's always this many pixels from the top of the view, this many pixels from the same with this like box right now. So it's positioned relative to the actual view window that I'm viewing everything through. This fixed position is something you're going to be using with Tweeter with your little navigation at the top. As you scroll down and look at the tweets, you want that navigation to come with you. A lot of sites do this type of thing, and it's most easily accomplished with fixed. So again, static's the default, and relative, absolute. Fixed is set relative to the viewport, so the element stays in the same position even when the content is scrolled. Oh, but we didn't with fixed what we cannot see. So if I go fixed, I can still give it top and left, bottom, whatever characteristics I want. Top 0, right 0. I refresh. It's in the 0 top, 0 right of the viewport. So as I scroll this, or as I change any of these things, it's going to move with me. The last position option is sticky. Sticky's kind of was popular for a while in some sites. It's as I'm scrolling through content, say this header here, when I reach a certain point scrolling to it, it's going to like come with me now, continue down the page until a certain point, and then it's going to get forgotten. If we have enough time, I'll show you some examples of sticky, but there's some other things that might be good to go over first. So we've been talking about classes a lot. There's another thing that we can do with our elements called IDs. Both IDs and classes are kind of hooks to grab elements in order to apply style to them. So we're like adding a hook into this when we had these things called boxes or fixed or absolute. I'm adding a hook so I can say this specific div in particular, I want to be able to find with my CSS to add new things to it. IDs behave the same way that we've been using classes, but they are stronger in specificity. If I say, something has an ID and I give it a style, that's stronger than saying apply this style to a class. Classes can be used on, the same class can be used on multiple elements. So here we had box being used on multiple elements, and multiple classes can be used on one element. So we had, these boxes had box and fixed, box and absolute. But IDs are unique. Each element can have at most one ID. So if I come in here and I go ID equals, I can go at most 1. I can't do space and then a second ID. I can only give this ID at most 1. And you should only have one element with a particular ID. So I shouldn't go ID and then give this other guy the same thing. That would be bad practice, and it's not going to break my stuff, but it's going to lead to some things battling in ways they shouldn't down the road. So stick to one ID per element and don't repeat it other places. The only other difference that IDs have is there's kind of a secret browser power that IDs have, and that is if in the URL I put hashtag and then like an ID name after my path, I can get the page to jump down to that specific thing. So I don't know if our page is big enough. And also, this isn't supported with everything. So we'll add in enough stuff so that it gets bigger. And then this very bottom one, I'll give it an ID of bottom. Save that. Refresh this page. And if I go hashtag bottom, it jumps me to the bottom of the page to where my fifth guy is. If we give this guy here an ID of almost the middle, not quite. I'll scroll to the top. Oh no. I'll go middle and hit enter. Let's try if I'm down here. MIDDLE. That wasn't like a box 5. So middle doesn't work, but bottom does. Let's try middle again. Oh, there we go. Maybe I didn't refresh properly. But so box 5 was our middle one. It's bringing it right to the top of my page. So it's going to go right there. Bottom's not the best example because it can't bring the ID element right to the top of my viewport because my page doesn't go down far enough. But that middle one is kind of a nice one to see. So the way people are using this a lot is if I mark down all my content with different IDs, I can have like a directory at the top that jumps them to like, you see this in document pages a lot, like go to the part of the docs that has to do with selectors and it jumps you down this like super long page to the part that you're looking for. But it's also used for CSS, which is the main thing we're concerned about here. Here we're declaring some classes, whereas here we're declaring some IDs. Elements can have both classes and IDs. So our bottom had a class and ID. And there's nothing you can do with a class that you can't do with an ID and vice versa. You can do the same amount of things. It's just IDs will be kind of stronger in specificity. However, classes and IDs are different in JavaScript. And you'll see that a little bit as you use some jQuery and JavaScript stuff with Tweeter. So we've seen pretty basic selectors up to this point in terms of what I've looked at. I have one class and I'm applying a style to it. But selectors can be built up of multiple things. So can anyone tell me the difference between these 3 selectors? They look very similar, but they're trying to grab very different elements in my document. So what does this first one do? Yeah, it's multiples. It's saying whatever style is here, apply it to div, and also apply it to the class primary. What about this one? That would be this one, actually. So this one is any primaries that are inside of divs. This one is saying any divs that also have the primary class attached to them. So they all look very similar, but they're kind of doing different things. It's good to start getting used to the different styles. I've included a link here. There's a lot more selector combinations you can use. So here's a list, any element matching A or B or C or whatever I want. Descendant, if B is a descendant of A. This one's kind of useful, I find. It's only if B is a direct descendant of A, or like the first descendant. So if B is a div that appears directly inside a div, not in 2 divs down, then this style will be applied to it. Then you have things like adjacent sibling and like general sibling. I mean, I don't tend to use these more complicated ones, but it's useful to know that they're there. And of course, you can have like combinations of them. So we can have container. If I want a relative class, that's a child of the container, but I want a relative and box. I want a element that has the relative and box classes, and is a child of a container class. So we can combine them in many ways. So the main thing that we're concerned with right now is specificity. And this is the idea of what style is being applied to my elements when they show up on the page. So why is this style being chosen over another style? This morning we looked at where those styles are coming from, whether they're like an inline style, whether they're embedded, or whether it's an external style sheet. And now we're going to look at if any of those styles that are all coming from different places conflict with each other, if they're both trying to set the color of the text, for example, which one is going to be applied. And that's done with this like specificity. The easiest way to think about this is like it's a number. You know, just this is like 11. And the higher the number for a style, the stronger its specificity is, and the more likely it is to be applied. So when you're comparing two styles, you just check which number is higher. So right now, this style example, there's 0 inline styles, it has 0 IDs, it has 1 class attribute, and it has 1 element. So that could, something that would have this specificity number would be if I did this. So for my selector here, div.relative, I have 1 class, div, and I have 1 class relative, and I have 1 element div that I'm selecting for. So for example, what would be the score of this guy here? Yeah, reverse. It would be 2, 1, because we have 2 classes and 1 element. So this guy would win over this one here. So if here I had color purple, and somewhere else I had this one, and both of the one element had both of these things in it, could be selected by both, this blue would like win out. It would be applied preferentially over this one. So let's look at a couple showdowns for some style. If we have this guy here versus this one, which is going to win? So we'll have red in this case because ID is higher than this one only has classes and elements. So it would be like 100 versus, no matter how many classes and elements this one has, a ID is always going to win. So what about this one? Will it be blue or, blue or blue? Will it be the top blue or the bottom blue? Well, let's just go like, will it be blue or red in this case? So again, our order we have is inline styles, IDs, classes, and then elements. So in this case, this guy's going to win because his score is, he has 0 inline, he has 0 IDs, but he has 2 classes, and then he has 0 elements. This one has 1 element, 1 class, and another element, or 2 elements and 1 class. So his score, he has 0 inline, 0 IDs, 1 class, and 2 elements. So we have 12 versus 20. 20, the bottom blue is going to be applied. Okay, last one. We have div.box.left versus div.box. What? So what's going to happen in this case? I mean, it should say red and blue. It would be the last one that was like loaded in the document. So the bottom one. But let's. I'm going to change this. How did I miss this? Yeah, so if we have things not being applied, if we're in any of these cases here where we're putting in red, but it's showing up blue, it's because there's something that's more specific in our CSS that's winning out. So you can get into this problem with CSS then where you're maybe like too specific. You're like, oh no, if something's going to overwrite me, I'm going to need to like do a div which has a child A, which then has a child P, which is then has a direct descendant of a link, which has the classes link, underline, and an ID home. This is going to get like super annoying to write, and it's not the best practice. You should first and foremost use IDs sparingly. IDs are kind of like your last ditch thing. They're only for styling one element. If you have something really unique that you want to throw down, maybe use an ID. But like if you can avoid them, like don't use IDs. The same thing is like with almost any selectors too. If you don't have to use it, then don't be like putting it in there. Simple is better. If I have like this link here, and I'm like, I want to style my links all a certain way, I'm going to give my links a class link, and then I'm going to apply like, maybe I'm going to make them orange with like really bold text and underline. I don't have to add this class to it if I'm just going to be doing it to all of my links. I know that they will all be in this A tag, so I can just apply my styles directly to the A tag. You can be very light-handed with your classes and things. Only apply them, when you need to, or else you get really like spaghetti classes everywhere, and you have to remember what is the class I use for my link tag, what was the class I use for this, do I have to be careful with this, that, and the other thing. And there's one more tool with this like battle for specificity. It's kind of like the Hail Mary tool that we can pull out, and it's important. If I use this important keyword after any of my CSS, this will now be the most specific thing that exists out there. So if I'm back up here in this case where I have, I'm trying to do it red and blue's coming out, Hail Mary move can just be to throw the important onto the end of this, and it will automatically be more specific than anything else. Yeah. Yeah, important will be inline. It is going to beat everything. But the problem with important, it's kind of similar to the problem with IDs, is that if we start using important really regularly, if we start putting important on a bunch of different things, like if everything is important, then nothing is important. We get into the same battle up here. If both of these are important, like nothing's changed. If two styles are important, then we just go back to specificity. We say, okay, they're both important, which one's more specific? So they should really be used like in a last case situation. The biggest case I see it kind of end up being used is people will import libraries or frameworks for CSS like Bootstrap, and that's just a big wall of CSS that we don't necessarily know where everything is. And you're like, oh, I really can't like apply this like header style because somewhere in Bootstrap's code it's like overwriting me. I'm going to throw down the like important. Some people you can like think maybe I'll set myself a budget for how many important like uses I can use. In this application, I'm not going to use any more than like 5 importance or something like that. It really is like if you find yourself using these all the time, maybe go back and like change how you've been grabbing, be less specific with all of your other stuff, so it's not as hard to overwrite when you need to. Any questions with like important and like specificity? Yeah.
Is it better practice to use important rather than just doing inline style that is right?
again, it's kind of like the tiered thing. So inline style is not as strong as important. So you can think like, this is pretty, like I really want this to be applied, I'm going to do it inline. And if down the line I still have the option to like important it. So I would go to inline first and then important. But that's the caveat with that is with inline you have to go into your HTML and actually add it inline. Sometimes that's ugly. Sometimes people, it's not the best thing to do. If you want to keep everything in here, you can. Yeah, and you'll get like kind of more familiar with like the best cases and the cases not to do it. If you can avoid both of them, that's the best. You're not going to be wanting to use this a lot. Kind of late in the lecture, but style of CSS is important as well. Just like with our code, we want consistent indentation. We want opening and closing brackets. Well, CSS, we need those. But our key value pairs should always be indented within our selector brackets. If we want to use notes within our CSS, we have these /* and //. But keep this in mind as well. Clean code is very important, whether it's CSS document or whether it's our JavaScript or whatever we're doing. So frameworks. This is something people always like really excited to like get into because they just like instantly up your style game kind of. If you just include Bootstrap into your project, you can start like throwing cool buttons in. You've got menus. You've got like all these things that are just popping up. Feels like you have superpowers going from like, margin left, like just tediously making your own custom buttons. You can just start loading stuff up. This has like its advantages and its disadvantages. Obviously, if you're not like the most design-oriented person in the world, and you go to like Bootstrap. Let's see, I think there's some examples here. You can get some real clean, nice-looking layouts, like fairly easy. I can go into the source code of this and like just look at a couple different classes that they've applied to, and I can make stuff look pretty good. To use frameworks, what they are, I guess I should have explained first, is they're just like a whole chunk of styling that someone else, some team has developed. In your index file, you're just going to link to that framework. So here, like below my style sheets are actually above. I could do like a link, and I could either download it locally, or I can use a CDN, a content delivery network, and find it somewhere else. So href. If I have Bootstrap locally, I can just use a local path, or I can use, let's see, using Bootstrap. So here's the Bootstrap CDNs that we can look up. Here's one right here. If I copy this, paste it right into the head of my thing. Now I have access to all of these styles that Bootstrap defines for me. And that means in here, I think if I make a button and I give it a class button, I think that's essentially there's all of these classes predefined by Bootstrap that will just take on the styling that they've defined. So if I give it a button and I give it some words, that's not one. We'll look up Bootstrap button. Type button class. So btn, if I copy this class right here, paste it right into my guy, and I refresh here, we can see I get this like stylized blue button, same as appears here or something. And Bootstrap has this for like tons of things. So they have buttons, they have navs, they have all of these other things. So it's a nice tool to lean on when we want fast, and Bootstrap is really good at being responsive as well, design. But the thing is, if we really want to customize how our stuff looks like, we're going to start running into those problems where we're like trying to overwrite styles that Bootstrap has done. We're going to start having to like use important or like inline styles and things like that. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword in terms of how you can use it. So I would suggest, getting a nice grip on CSS yourself, learning how to do some styling and like getting things to behave in the way that you want before you jump right into using Bootstrap. But again, not all of us are necessarily going to be so focused on front-end design and layout and stuff like that. And so if it's something that you're not as concerned with, you can check out a framework. There's other ones too. There's one called Semantic UI. There's one called Materialize. You can look at their document pages and see kind of the style they're going for. There's also like a couple other benefits to using it. Like this morning we talked about like grid system. So Bootstrap has a grid system that you can use. Maybe you just get Bootstrap to use the grid for it. So we can look here, we can see Bootstrap grid. Yeah, the Rage gaming systems. So, here we have 2 rows with one with 2 columns in it, one with 3 columns in it, and right below we can see the kind of easy classes we can apply to our own HTML to get that grid and row stuff set up. So be aware that those tools are out there, and play around with them, but try and get that base foundation of CSS built up first before you jump too heavily into just relying on Bootstrap. I promised we'd come back and would look at Sticky. So Sticky is the newest of these positions. It works like really well. Not a lot of people use it, I find, but so if I give box number, let's do this one here. I'll give it a class of Sticky. And onto our position classes, I'll add the new class Sticky. We'll give it a position. Ooh. Position of Sticky. And I can also give it a top maybe of 0. If we go in here and I refresh, we can see this 4th guy here. He's not really the 4th anymore. The numbers are all messed up. But he behaves statically until the top of my viewport reaches him. And then he's going to behave like he's fixed until the end of the container is reached. So he's inside this, see this border here, that's our container. We got him fixed. And then when he hits the bottom, he like leaves behind. So this would be really helpful if we could think that this container represented like I had a paragraph of content in here, and I had number 4 as my header. And as someone's going down and reading all of my paragraph, the header stays at the top, they can see what's going on, and then when they're finished with that division of content, they go on to the next one. And then you could have the sticky for that top thing. We could even get so I'm going to add sticky instead of the bottom one. We'll add it to this top box. And then I'm just going to copy the container with all of its boxes in it, and I'm going to paste it once, twice. The tabs are horrible, but let's look and see what that does for us. So this is all my content. My pretend header stays at the top, and then when we get to the bottom of the thing, it disappears. And then we pick up the next guy. We're going through, and then we drop them off. And then we pick up the other one, and like so far. So this is like really maybe like ugly looking, but if we had nice headers and content, it would be pretty cool. The other option with sticky is if I don't want to pick it up on the top, and for some reason I kind of want to do the reverse and pick it up starting on the bottom, I could give it a bottom of 0. If I refresh, we're not getting anything. Let's see. Bottom. If we maybe change where we're using those sticky guys, so let's see. First one, sticky's at the top. Let's move it to the bottom so it can stick to the bottom. Let's move this guy too. And we'll see if that helps us at all. Okay. Oh, there you go. So this 3 guy, I can't see the bottom, so he sticks up to the bottom, but when I hit the bottom of the content, I'm going to leave him behind. Same with this one. He's being left a little strangely, like he should be probably left here. But, I mean, that's something we'd have to figure out if we wanted to continue with this lucrative box website layout. But any questions before we wrap things up about specificity or positioning or Bootstrap and frameworks that you might end up using? Cool. Keep at the CSS. And I'll be around. Let me know if you have any questions about any of this, and I'll do my best to answer. Thanks, guys. Also, I need a new mouse now.